Have you ever driven down the beautiful Highway 101 on the central coast of California and seen what looks like brown islands floating out in the sea? Have you ever wondered what lives under those brown islands? Come join marine biologist Terry Lilley and assistant Sue Sloan on once-in-a-lifetime adventure where they did over 1,000 scuba dives off kayaks. The central coast of California is very rugged, lots of big waves and currents, and there are no dive boats. Come join them and see animals that are rarely seen by human beings in an area that is studied less than the moon. It was a cold November morning, and Sue and I started getting our kayaks ready to go out and do a dive in an outside kelp bed that we've taken movies of in the past. We really hope to find a reef below the kelp that we know hundreds of different colorful sponges are there that we want to take video of.
The diving along the Central Coast is best in the winter because the water has less algae in it. It's much colder, which causes the algae not to grow, and so the water's a lot clearer, you have much better visibility. It's only about 50 degrees.
When we look out at the ocean sometimes on these dives and know we want to go out and take movies, we look at each other and say, "Are you sure you really want to do this?" It really doesn't look like anything a human would want to go do, but it's well worth it once you get under the water.
Terry and I talk about our dive before going out, and we usually have a plan for filming and how deep we're going to go, how long we're going to be out. But oftentimes things change, so we've had to develop extensive hand signals to tell each other if we have problems or if we see an unusual creature that we want to film.
And after 200 dives that we did together, it was pretty amazing because we literally could look at each other 4 to 5 feet away and see a minor hand signal. It takes us about a half an hour to unload our gear and start our adventure out to sea. The wind is calm today, which makes the half-mile paddle easier, and we warm up as we paddle out. Sometimes it's incredibly cold if we're diving close to shore. The further out we get, and the more paddle we have on the kayak with our wetsuits on, the more we can warm up. The wind may come up while we're down under, and we've had our kayaks break free in the wind and wash to the shore in the past, leaving us with a very cold, dangerous 2-hour swim to shore in rough seas. Another time we had a large seal to try to get up on our kayak while being chased by a big shark, and it sunk the kayak. Once again, we had a long swim to shore with all of our dive gear and camera gear.
One of the difficult things about paddling out with the wetsuit on is these are 7.0 millimeter wetsuits, which means they're very thick and stiff. And so when you have them zipped all the way up with the hood on and everything, which you pretty much need to do, it's very constricting. But once I got out there and dropped down, it was all worth it.
This is actually a brand new way of scuba diving, and we had to kind of just wing it and invent it as we went along. Once we find our dive spot, we drop an anchor and also tie up to the kelp.
Once we have set the anchor, we start putting on our dive gear, which is the fins, mask, gloves. The main part of the dive gear is the BC and the tank, which we pull off the kayak and float in the water. We have to put our tanks on while floating in the water, which takes a long time to learn to do correctly.
After we get in the water, I pull the camera off the kayak with the set of underwater lights and usually strap the lights to Sue's arm because she does all the lighting. Sue and I actually have practiced this probably 100 times before we figured out a good way to actually get in the water with these cameras and lighting, do it safely, and get down to the bottom where we can start doing some filming. You're really pretty much on your own most of the time, especially while you're taking movies.
We let the air out of our BC. We sink quickly because we have weights on, and it's like going into a deep sleep and dreaming. It's my favorite part of a dive is as we start dropping down, I just relax and I feel like I'm in my element and where I need to be. It's a whole new world, just feet below the surface, and our eyes must adjust to the different lighting. And it makes you keenly aware that you have no idea where you're going or what lies below you.
First thing we notice when we drop down a few feet is that kelp spreads out over the surface and looks very thick on top. But under the water, it grows on thin stalks called stipes that are spread out usually 10 to 20 feet apart. It's really quite eerie because people look at the kelp bed and they see this solid mass of kelp on top. But when you drop underneath it, you don't see that. And you see this thin layer of kelp on the top and then these stipes. But when you look back up, you can see the sun coming through the holes in the kelp canopy. It looks like the sun is dancing. It's absolutely one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen.
And one of my favorite things on a dive in the kelp are what we termed mermaid kelp. It's not a scientific name, but they remind us of mermaids. It's bull kelp, and it's on a long, tall, thick stipe, and there's long blades of the kelp that flow behind it like long hair. So it looks like a mermaid dancing underwater.
As we drop down and view the kelp stipes 30 to 40 feet below us, we can see the bottom coming up. The water is clear today, but we often dive where it is pitch black, and halfway to the bottom we need our lights on just to see where we're going.
Below about 60 feet, the red wavelength goes away. You can't see red. It just looks black or kind of dark gray. But then as soon as you turn your light on a subject, if it's red, you can see the red.
Yeah, the first time I saw these red rockfish without dive lights and they were black underwater at 80 feet deep, I didn't know what fish species this was. I was amazed to see that that was a red rockfish. As you're dropping down the kelp, though, we get greeted almost everywhere by these huge schools of barracuda, of blue rockfish, of black rockfish, olive rockfish, and perch. And these fish just come right up to you.
We would drop down into a big school of fish, and he'd look over at me, and I would be sitting there waving at him to say hi, because they're just so cute, and I just love to see them.
That was really a very special thing to me because I got to see Sue intermix with a bunch of animals under the ocean that have probably never seen a human being before. Many of our dives in areas that no people have ventured into before. And it's like going to a planet deep in space for the first time. I always wanted to be an explorer, to find Africa for the first time hundreds of years ago, or maybe to go to Mars. And what I realized after doing these dives, that we basically have Mars right out here in the ocean. We have all this ocean, thousands of miles. It's cold, it's dark, it's in places where dive boats don't get to. And we're keenly aware of that we're dropping into an environment and going down into an environment that no humans have ever been to, nor have the animals ever seen people. Sue and I have dropped down off the kayak into complete darkness, turned on their lights facing a whole school of sharks. It's really, really a very profound feeling. It's just absolutely the most exciting thing I've ever done. Once we get down through the fish, usually towards the bottom, we normally meet a harbor seal. And these animals can be the goofiest animals in the world. They will zoom right in front of you. They will come right up to the camera, look right in your face, and you can tell they are very curious about what they're seeing. One of them we nicknamed Nibbles because it continually tried to bite on all of Sue's gear. And remember the time, Sue, when I turned you around?
It was one of our most frustrating dives for me because I was aware there was a seal. Obviously, he was right there with us, but Terry kept trying to turn me around, and I wasn't understanding what he was trying to do. Our hand signals weren't working. We weren't communicating. And finally, I realized there was a seal that was nibbling on my gear, and it was trying to pull on my hoses. So Terry kept trying to move me and turn me so that the seal wouldn't damage any of the hoses and cause some problems.
Once you get all the way to the bottom, then you start seeing all kinds of different colorful creatures. It's amazing. And then you can look back up all the way to the surface and see the bull kelp and the giant kelp. On the bottom, it is just literally covered with life everywhere you look. And all of these sea creatures, the big starfish and the sponges and all the creatures are all moving in and around the kelp holdfast, which is the exposed roots of the kelp that anchor the kelp to the bottom. It is so quiet and peaceful that you literally can easily go into a full dream-like state. Looking at these animals, looking at the beauty, having the surge going back and forth, and completely forget that you're diving, that you have to breathe. And it's really something that divers have to learn to deal with to be safe. And then once you're down and you're looking around, once again, it kind of looks like thousands of flowers everywhere. All of these unbelievably beautiful colors completely covering the reef almost everywhere you look. We start our dive on the bottom, and immediately we see many bright-colored sea slugs called nudibranchs that breathe through gills exposed on the top of their bodies. Nudibranch means nude bronchia or nude gills. Most of these little critters are only 2 to 4 inches long, and they come in every color of the rainbow, but they're incredibly difficult for us to get movies of.
In fact, with the current underwater and the surge, oftentimes I'm holding the light with one hand, holding onto a rock with my other hand, and my feet are directly above me, flowing back and forth in the surge. It's incredibly difficult to keep the lighting still on the subject and keep myself anchored.
And at the same time Sue's doing that, I'm actually filming here with one hand on the camera. I have my arm and my leg and my shoulder pinned in a crack to try to get myself stable enough to hold the camera on the nudibranch at the same time Sue's holding the light on the nudibranch. Many times over, a big wave has come through, and I'm filming, and I'm watching the nudibranch here, not Sue, and all of a sudden the light disappears, and Sue's gone. I mean, literally gone.
I would just be pulled
completely
away.
Washed away. And then I'd have to break off, go find her, 10, 15, sometimes 20 feet away. Then we'd come back, find the Spanish shawl nudibranch again, and start taking pictures. It was a lot of fun, but it was really a difficult thing to do. There's dozens of different nudibranchs that live down there. Many, many, many different colors, many, many different sizes. These yellow nudibranchs here actually eat volcano sponges. They eat these bright red sponges. There are nudibranchs that are orange and white. There's some that are rainbow colors. They're absolutely stunning creatures that look like they come from some other place on this planet. We often would find a nudibranch that we've never seen before and didn't even know that occurred in this area. We've even found nudibranchs and sponges that were growing and living their whole life on top of crabs. And it looked like the reef until the crab stood up and got up and walked away with the nudibranchs and sponges right on their back. The entire bottom, almost everywhere you go in the Central Coast and on this dive, is covered with beautiful different sponges. And these sponges actually are the real sponge that people used to harvest and sell in stores that people used in their kitchens, a regular old sponge. Some of these sponges look like puff balls. They're orange, round. Others look like little lemons. These here are called the nipple sponges. And the most amazing one is the big giant moon sponge. Some of these sponges are over 5 feet long and 2 to 3 foot wide. They have all these holes in them where they suck in water and filter out water. Mixed in with the sponges are all kinds of different anemones.
There's hundreds of different anemones that are all brilliantly, brightly, and beautifully colored. They range from these small club-tipped anemones that cover the reef to the giant red fish-eating anemones that actually eat fish. They sting the fish with their tentacles as they swim by, and they eat them. The rose anemones look like strawberries when they contract, and they look like a beautiful rose when they're open. Many of these eat small animals and also filter particles from the water. There are so many different colors, and we've seen many different pictures of them in books, and we've also seen some that we can't find pictures of in books. Like, we don't know if they've ever been seen.
On the Central Coast here, in these places where we have dove at, once again, there hasn't been scientists or biologists or people that have dove there and documented the species, and we really believe there's a number of very unusual species, if not a number of brand new species to science. One of the most unusual ones are these giant metridiums that get to be about 3 feet long. On this dive we saw literally hundreds and hundreds of them, and I never ever will forget Sue's face when we were dropping down and she saw these big giant anemones that look like cauliflower growing all over the reef.
It was one of the most exciting moments of all of my dives, even our tropical dives. This was outside of Morro Bay at a place called the Tenny Buoy. We're dropping down, and it's just the usual kind of murky water. We're dropping, and all of a sudden, opens up on the bottom is just this field of gorgeous white metridiums, just like looking down on a Q-tip forest. So I turned to Terry, and I'm motioning like, come on, hurry up. We've got to get down here. This is gorgeous.
Q-tip forest, I kind of like that. Do you think we can get some scientific name on that, Metridium q-tipiensis? One of the things you'll see on this dive, which was really amazing, sometimes you don't recognize the anemones, the big metridiums and the rose anemones. When there's more surf and you see the surge going back and forth, they close up into these little tight balls on the reef, and they look like a strawberry pincushion or just a little white kind of nipple on the reef. And these are these big giant anemones that actually close up and hunker down right to the reef.
The reef is also covered with small invertebrates like these feather duster worms and scallops, both of which retract when you get close. You'll see the feather duster worms, they're all spread out and flowy, and then suddenly they'll suck into their little tube. I think it's more the pressure of the water, of just our bodies getting closer to them. Terry says it's the light. Neither of us really know, but we've tested it often enough, but we still don't really know. And the scallops do the same thing. When you get close to them, they close.
You know, it's a really hard thing when you're studying an animal like this, that there isn't any books or anything that you can usually, as a reference guide, to figure out why a scallop closes. These animals don't have eyes. When we get up close to them, they close. So it's really kind of a mystery as to why and how they pull that off. These hydroids that grow on the kelp only grow in the summertime here, so we got to see them during this dive, only just a few of them. In the wintertime, most of them are stripped off the reef. One of the cool things is when you're watching the reef and you think you're looking at a rock, and all of a sudden it's a crab and it gets up and walks away, or an octopus that gets up and cruises out of your field of view. The reef is covered with literally hundreds of animals that are really camouflaged, and often you don't see them until you're right up within an inch or two, and then all of a sudden they just get up and move. It's a fascinating place that has all these different spiral snails called top snails, and it has barnacles that are all covered up with anemones and sponges, warty sea cucumbers. There are so many different critters that cover the reef here.
We sometimes don't notice what's right next to us, so I'm lighting some beautiful top snail, and I look over and there's a lingcod laying right next to Terry.
These lingcod can grow to be over 4 feet long and actually live all the way down to 1,500 feet deep. They're one of the most amazing predators in the entire ocean. They have huge teeth, several rows of them. They normally eat octopus, but they will also eat other small fish, and they'll even eat other lingcod. The lingcod are often hanging out on the bottom of the reef, and they sit very calmly waiting for an octopus to come by, and then they zoom out really fast, eat the octopus, and then they'll turn right around and go back and sit in the very same spot. They have these big blue-green eyes for seeing in the depths. You often will see these big lingcods, like this one, sitting back in the caves. These cabezon are amazing. They're actually very common and all over the reef. You just don't normally see them. They have fins above their eye. They're called cirrus. And those cirrus and their fins actually look like flowing kelp that moves back and forth. Most of the time, divers never see cabezon because they're so well blended into the reef. This 4-foot shark will fill its belly up with water when threatened and pin itself in a cave for protection. They normally come out at nighttime and sleep in the caves, like these two, during the daytime. They have cat-like eyes that shine in the dive lights. Then you have these beautiful little horned sharks that mimic the sandy, gravelly bottom, and they usually just sit there and they don't move until you get real close to them and they think they've been discovered. They only get about 4 foot long, and all of these sharks are very harmless. Sometimes we've seen maybe 10 or 12 of them in one dive, and maximum size is maybe 5 feet long. These little horn sharks are really super, super cute. Occasionally we see the big sharks. I've had great white sharks right out here on our dives come right up to us after doing some spearfishing. But most of the time we never see the big sharks. This is an angel shark, and coming across this thing on the sand is really amazing because they're usually camouflaged and you don't see them. Occasionally we come across halibut and this very unusual turbot sitting on the bottom.
Terry went right over this turbot, and I saw it kind of partially buried in the sand. So I motioned for him, grabbed his fin, and pulled him back and said, "You got to see this."
They have really strange eyes, as you can see on top of their head, and they're called flatfish, but they lay on the bottom. Both their eyes are actually on one side of their head, and they can work independently watching their environment up above.
The kelp that grows on the reef can be very thick and filled with many fish, from red rockfish to small red kelp fish. They blend into the kelp and the algae. With the lights off, they appear green or black, and that helps them stay hidden on the reef from predators.
Most divers just go right over these fish and never see them at all, especially these little red kelp fish. They just blend in so well. Sue actually spotted this one and was pointing at it with her finger, and I probably spent a good 3 or 4 minutes looking at this fish before I could figure out what I was looking at. I thought I was just looking at the kelp. They blend in that well. Once again, the kelp forest here has so much life, and it's so detailed and so much in one small area, you really have to stop and look close to see. The other fish that we see here that's very common are the painted greenling and the kelp greenling. But once again, if you don't slow down and look and really look at these fish and get the lights on them, you're going to go right over the top of them and never see them because they just look like the reef structure below us. The rockfish are very common along the Central Coast, and we see a lot of them in our dive here. And most of the time they're hanging back in the caves. When they get frightened, like these little tree fish, they bolt back into the cave to get away from any potential predators. These black and yellow rockfish, sometimes we see 8 to 10 to 15 in one cave. Often, when you go down and you turn on the lights, they come right out of the cave and come up and look at you. You have the brown rockfish that'll live right in the same cave or the entrance of the cave with the black and yellows. And then you have gopher cod.
Now, these two black and yellow rockfish, we weren't really sure what was going on with them. We couldn't tell if they were kissing or if they were fighting.
These brown rockfish are in the caves, and when you turn the lights on them, you often wonder what in the world they think. They'll sit there and be very calm and look at you. I think that they don't feel like we know they're there, and then all of a sudden they'll bolt away.
One time Terry had the idea of, hey, let's take some fish guts down and squid and feed them and just see what their behavior's like. So that's exactly what we did. And we took some squid down and dropped it and watched them feed. And it was really fun to watch them, watch their behavior.
You can't help but just sitting there sometimes, like here when we're diving with them, and have a conversation with them. These kelp rockfish literally dance in front of you, and they're so tame. I gave Sue the camera, and then she shot this movie of me literally just petting these kelp rockfish. No fear of people. They come right up to you. You can reach your hand out. You can touch them under the chin. And they're just wonderful creatures to watch. These blue rockfish and olive rockfish and the perch, they tend to pretty much hang out in the same area, kind of mid-level in the kelp bed. And when Sue's cruising around looking for them and seeing them, most of the time I look around, she's going to give each one of them a little bit of a wave. They are very, very, very cool creatures. This is the grassy rockfish or grass rockfish. They actually will sit right on the bottom and blend in with the kelp so you don't see them until you get right up close to them. We will see sometimes 100 to 300 of these rockfish on one dive. These olive rockfish will just hang out right in the kelp with the kelp rockfish and the blue bass. And the interesting part of it, you don't have to go and look for them. All you need to do is sit there, and these big schools of rockfish and kelp rockfish and regular rockfish and black and yellows, they will actually just come right up to you and investigate who you are.
The reef has many cracks and caves, and they're packed full with all kinds of odd-looking creatures like this wolf eel. The male's about 7 feet long, and his head is the size of a soccer ball. I was amazed. We'd seen many of these on our dives and filmed many of them oftentimes, and all you see is their head. And I was amazed the first and only time, actually, that I saw one swim out. And it's a fish body, basically, with this big old head on the front of it.
You can see the monkey face eels here in the cracks. They also want to come out and look at you. Also in the caves, we see lobsters. There are a lot of lobsters along the Central Coast, and they're one of the coolest creatures. They usually come out only at nighttime. So in order to see them during the daytime, you have to shine the bright lights back into the caves. And these here that we took the pictures of are actually large-sized lobsters. I mean, some of these are 1.5 feet long and weigh 4 to 5 pounds. A lot of people don't realize we have lobsters along the Central Coast. Here's one that I caught so I could show and get a close-up look. We also have rock crabs back in the caves. These are the type crab that people eat. The big sheep crab, when we came across this, is an amazing sight. It looks like a giant tick. This thing is the size of a volleyball. And I'll have to admit, you get a little bit of a creepy feeling thinking this thing's going to jump out and grab you by the head and start eating you or something. They're totally afraid of people. They're completely harmless. But the way they walk across the seafloor here is just amazing. This sheep crab here is a pair, and they're mating. We were really amazed when we came around the corner and saw these and shined the lights on. And they're actually stuck together in mating, and so when they're crawling away together here. The width of the claws on the sheep crab are about 2.5 feet across when you go from claw to claw.
We looked in some of these cracks, and they were just lined with layer upon layer of abalone.
We also did some dives down in the Santa Barbara area, and we're showing this footage here as a comparison. In the Santa Barbara, Southern Cal area, you have a lot of sea urchins. You also have these beautiful gorgonians, which are invertebrates here. that go back and forth in the waves, and it's very, very, very beautiful. But in the Central Coast here, we don't have many sea urchins because we have sea otters, and the sea otters eat the sea urchins. And the sea urchins will eat kelp. So therefore, with sea otters here, we have a very healthy kelp forest. It's very balanced. But down in Southern California, where you have all these beautiful gorgonians, you also have a lot of sea urchins, and the kelp forest in Southern California is dying away because of the lack of sea otters. Also in this beautiful Southern California kelp forest, we have the gorgeous Garibaldi, which are not very many of them up here in the Central Coast. Occasionally someone will see one. We've never seen them up here in our dives or on this dive. But the Garibaldi will hide in cracks, and they're back there with the lobsters and lots of sea urchins. This French head fish was one of the strangest creatures I've ever seen. It was actually living in an old pipe, we think, that someone probably threw off the boat. Also down in Southern California, you have a lot of fish species that eat sea urchins. So what I asked Sue to do was to take a sea urchin and crack it open.
Actually, one of the funnest experiences I had while diving was when we would feed the fish, because you take a sea urchin and you smack it on the rock and you break it all open, and the fish just come in droves. They just swarm all around you.
And there were so many of them at one time, like these kelp bass, and they also call them calico bass. There must have been 100 fish, including the red sheephead, that were all sitting there eating this one sea urchin out of Sue's hands.
Many of the starfish eat algae or dead animals, and they come in every color of the rainbow.
They're really one of the most colorful things down there, including with this blood star, that are absolutely bright red. You almost never even see one of these things move. You can see some of these things 10, 15 feet away, and they look pretty much unnatural. You got a brown reef, and then these bright red starfish, and these giant spine sea stars, and then the bat stars, and all of them are different colors. I mean, you almost never see one that's the same color as another one. You have the orange ones here. Hundreds and hundreds of these are on almost every single one of our dives. This is a giant sun star, and we discovered one that was over 4 foot long, where Sue actually laid down next to it. These things are gigantic, and we found out they move very quickly. Sue actually one time offered him a little piece of squid.
And it ran to get the squid, and I was amazed. I didn't know a starfish could move that fast.
It literally took one of its foot-long arms, like the sun star here, and literally just reached right out with its arm, grabbed the squid out of Sue's hand, and brought it right back.
After about an hour of diving, we are basically frozen. We can't hold the camera or the dive light steady. It's time to get to the surface.
When you shift back from the seafloor and look back up as you're coming back up to the top, and you see the sun coming through the kelp, once again, you really realize the magnitude of a dive like this, to where you are in another world, and it's coming back into the real world now, and there's a real transition. You're cold, you're incredibly peaceful, you're seeing the sun dance underneath the kelp, and when you pop your head out of the water, all of a sudden it's like, wow, we have gone to another world. This is such a special place that very few people ever get to visit.
I would just be giddy with excitement.
How could you not be that way after seeing right at the surface this moon jellyfish and look at its reflection underneath the water? Once we're up on top of the water, it's really difficult to get back to the kayaks and to try to get your gear off and pull up 80 pounds of equipment onto the kayak. Sometimes it took Sue and I an hour to do this one individual process. We would have the surf that had picked up or the wind that had picked up, and you're so cold it's very difficult to try to negotiate and work with your equipment.
More than once, we would come up after a dive, and this is after about an hour of diving. We'd come up, and in our area here, the conditions can change quickly. And we'd go down, and it would be a nice day, and by the time we came up, it would be windy, there'd be big chops, it'd be hard to get on the kayak. It was pretty difficult.
Once we get up on the kayak and paddle back to shore, we still have a long part of the dive left to do. We have 3 flights of stairs that are over 200, 300 stairs going straight up the cliff that we now have to carry all the dive gear. After being underwater for an hour and super cold, and then coming back into a warmer environment, paddling back to shore, carrying 200, 300 pounds of equipment up 3 flights of stairs isn't very fun. As you notice, while we're in the process of doing this, we're probably not smiling quite as much as we did on the way down.
But then by the time we get home and we get back inside and we download the movies and just be just as enthralled watching it as we were when we filmed it the first time.
One of the great things about the high-definition video is that when we took our dive, we got to see with our own eyes all of these wonderful creatures in the kelp forest. But this camera actually sees 30% better than the human eye does underwater. It brings in more light. We sit there and watch the movies on the computer or the television, and we get to relive this amazing adventure that we just got done doing into this almost unknown world. Sometimes we'll watch these movies 3 to 4 times over and see a new animal each time we watch the movie. And it really, once again, just shows us how fortunate we are to be able to go out into the kelp forest on the Central Coast, do an amazing dive like this, and have a phenomenal experience that we'll cherish the rest of our lives. I want to dedicate this movie to my mom and my dad for introducing me to the beauty of the ocean.
I hope you enjoyed your adventure with Terry and Sue into the beautiful Central Coast Kelp Forest. Be sure to look for our next DVD series, which includes beautiful footage of Central Coast rockfish, sharks, rays, and flatfish, lobsters from the reef to the dinner table, herons, egrets, and other shorebirds, and kayak scuba diving and fishing.